Okay, I think we can start now. So hello, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the research report launch, Gender-Based Discrimination Labor in Serbia. Today's event is organized by the Belgrade office of the Kvinna Foundation with the support of partner organizations which are gathered together in the program Furthering Women's Labor Rights. I will be the moderator of the event, and my name is Tamara Schmidling. I work as a program officer in Kvinna's Belgrade office. And before I introduce us more in detail to today's event and topic, first of all, I have to make sure that we are all on the same page with technology. So first things first, as you know with Zoom, that's how it goes. So it is important to be mentioned at this point that we have IT support throughout the duration of the event. If you need any assistance with this, please write a message to Jim Rayleigh using Zoom chat feature. So you will find Jim in the participant list, and he's here to help you with any problems that you might have with Zoom. Simultaneous translation will be provided also throughout the duration of the event. On the bottom of your screen, you will see a button labeled interpretation. If you click to that button, you can check either translation to Serbian or English. So you can click this button and select the language that you need. And I will tell this now in Serbian for those people in public who do not understand me at this point, maybe. Tako da za one koji još do sada se nisu snašli sa prijevodom, imamo obezbeđenu podršku za IT. Ukoliko imate bilo kakvih problema, možete pisati Jimu Rayleighu. A što se tiče prevoda, on je obezbeđen, simultani prevod, dakle za čitav događaj je obezbeđen, i u dnu ekrana vidjet ćete jednu ikonicu koja izgleda kao globus gdje piše interpretation. Kada kliknete na tu ikonicu možete odabrati prevode na jezik koji vam treba i onda ćete moći da slušate sve na jeziku koji razumete. If you have any questions or comments throughout the duration of the event, feel free to write them. Your comments you can put in chat feature. Just make sure that it is that you select it for everyone so that we can all see your comments. And for questions like more formal and more structured questions, so to say, there is also separate feature at the bottom of your screen. You will see Q&A, and there is the place basically where you can put your questions. So we will try really to follow all your questions and comments, and we will try really to find time to respond to them. And one more important notice, this event is being recorded, just for all of you to know. Kvinna Foundation, I want to say just a few words about the organizer of today's event. So Kvinna Foundation promotes women human rights in over 20 conflict-affected or post-conflict countries in the Middle East, Africa, Europe, and the South Caucasus. We do so by supporting more than 130 local partner organizations across the world. So we are really partnering closely with local grassroots autonomous women civil society organizations and groups in different parts of the world. The organization has a focus on women, peace and security, and collaborates with women's organizations that play an active role in peace and transition processes, as well as promoting women human rights and gender equality. So that is our mission, really. In just a few sentences, Kvinna also has an office in Serbia, in Belgrade, and we are working here on different programs. And one of the program is basically the program that we will be presenting today. So that is Regional Women Labor Rights Program. called Furthering Women's Labor Rights. That is a regional program that is funded by the European Union and co-funded by the Swedish International Development Cooperation Agency. And Kvinna is currently one of 6 implementing partners in that program. The program is led by Kosovo Women's Network, a women's rights civil society organization from Pristina, Kosovo, and they are really our close partner organization. With them and other partner organizations from Bosnia and Herzegovina, Montenegro, Macedonia, we basically established some kind of coalition of leading women's rights civil society organization from the region, implemented this 4-year program. Program started back in 2018, and this is basically the last year of the program. And program is focused on research, strategic litigation, awareness raising, legal aid, and advocacy at both national and regional levels. So we will mention later on during the program why both regional and national levels are important for us when it comes to gender-based discrimination and labor. And the purpose of the program is to contribute to processes of creating systemic changes in the region when it comes to improving hiring practices and mitigating discrimination pertaining to women's labor, which is really the probably one of the most crucial problems at the moment when it comes to human rights, and especially to women human rights. The implementation of anti-discrimination legislation remains weak throughout the region, and very few discrimination cases seems to be reported or addressed by courts. As a result, there is little existing or accessible case law related to discrimination. And in order to fill this information gap on data regarding women's economic rights, Kvinna has conducted research on gender-based violence, gender-based discrimination in labor. And this is a 2nd edition of the research conducted in 2018 and published in 2019. In this 2nd edition, basically the same methodology was repeated to assess the extent to which there have or have not been improvement in these fields. Besides the research findings, the report contains an overview of the legal framework and recommendations for the EU, national institutions, and other relevant stakeholders in the context of women's equal access to labor and economic livelihood. The English and Serbian versions of the report, it is important also to say, are available on Kvinna website, and the link will be shared in the chat of this event. So our colleague Sofia will do that and share link to you so that you can all access the reports. At today's launch, we will have 4 speakers, and they will try to bring the issue of gender-based discrimination and labor closer to us from different angles, perspectives, and positions. So it is important really that we tried to gather persons who can really offer some insights into this problematic, but from different perspectives and from different angles. I will introduce, of course, individually each one of our panelists today, but just for the brief information at the very beginning. With us today are Leoneta Pajer from EU delegation in Serbia, Sofia Vrbaški from the Kvinna Foundation, Nicole Farnsworth from Kosovo Women Network, and Sanja Ćopić from Victimology Society of Serbia. So each one of them will present you one piece of the puzzle, so to say, when it comes to gender-based discrimination and the labor. And after their presentations, there will be a time, of course, for question and answers. And we are really looking forward to receive your questions and comments in regards to this, we think, really important topic, not just for Serbia, but for the whole region of Western Balkan, and probably also globally, especially during COVID-19 crisis. So now I would like to continue with our program and to basically give word to Leonetta Payer from the delegation of European Union in Serbia, head of operations 1, and Leonetta will provide us with opening statement basically for this event. So Leonetta, please.
Thank you very much, Tamara, and welcome to everyone. I'm very happy to participate to this event. Normally, the previous year has been our former head of cooperation, but now I'm very happy I can be myself here, since the topic of gender-based discrimination, particularly in the labor sector, is a topic very close to my heart. As you know, as a European Union, we are engaged since many years on the issue of gender equality and bring closer the gap between women and men. I will touch upon a number of elements that the European Union has put in place and is pursuing in this area, which I think are important, of course, for Serbia as an acceding country, but is, of course, being part of the enlargement process is important for the entire region. First of all, I would like to mention the new action plan for the gender equality and women's empowerment in external action, which is for the period 2021 to 2025. For those that are familiar with it, is the GAP 3, which was adopted at the end of 2020, and it sets out an ambitious agenda to promote gender equality and women's empowerment through all external actions of the European Union. And it reflects the objective of the EU Gender Equality Strategy 2021-2025, and also builds on the experience of the evaluation made on the previous GAP. Of course, given the period in which it was prepared and adopted, GAP 3 also reflects the challenges that the pandemic of COVID-19 has showed us in the last 2 years now. And both from the health, but also the socioeconomic perspective. And its aims is also to harness the EU role as a global frontrunner in promoting gender equality to address the structural inequalities that have been shown during the pandemic and build back a more equal and inclusive, gender-inclusive societies. The GAP 3 is based on 3 principles. First, gender transformative approach. Secondly, addressing intersectionality of gender with other forms of discrimination, and human rights approach. As a key step of the process, the delegations last year have updated the country profile, and I would like to thank here all of you, including Kvinna, for your inputs on this last year. And the country profile covers 6 areas of intervention, which are ensuring freedom from all forms of gender-based violence, promoting sexual and reproductive health and rights, promoting economic and social rights and empowering girls and women, promoting equal participation and leadership, integrating the women, peace and security agenda, and climate change and environment and digitalization, which, as you know, are top on the priorities of the von der Leyen Commission. The country profile aims to provide all the necessary data and information to support the integration of a gender perspective into EU policies, programs and projects in the country, as well as the development of a country-level implementation plan. It has been developed through a participative approach, as I mentioned, with the national institutions, international organizations, EU member states, but also civil society organizations. And I repeat, I thank the contribution you do, because otherwise, without that, our assessment would not be anyway complete. On another note, I mean, looking more at the angle of the labor side, as you are aware, in 2017, now 5 years ago, the Parliament, the European Parliament and the Council and the Commission have proclaimed the European Pillar of Social Rights, which sets out 20 principles and rights to support fair and well-functioning labor markets and welfare systems. The Commission in these 5 years has translated into practice these different the pillars, and examples which we have also supported in Serbia relates to help working parents and carers manage their family life and their professional careers, update to the EU health and safety legislation, and a proposal for more predictable and transparent working conditions. And also a proposal for a recommendation on access to social protection for workers and the self-employed, which often are left, unfortunately, out of much of this legislation, especially when it comes to women and maternity in this respect. Balancing work and family life, of course, is a daily challenge for all women and men all over Europe, and most of us have a first-hand experience. And the EU has adopted a directive on work-life balance, which aims to strengthen the rights and improve the condition of working parents and carers to reconcile work and family responsibilities. This gives more flexibility and better protection to mothers and fathers and carers, whether they wish to take time off to take care for their children or their close relatives, but also benefit from flexible working arrangements and wish to go back to work. Of course, then this needs to be translated in the national legislation. The European, another element is the Gender Equality Index, which is prepared by the European Institute for Gender Equality, which is the EU monitoring tool for gender equality. It plays a crucial role in assessing the impact of the different measures I also just mentioned, and bringing evidence to policymakers in the years to come on what needs to be adjusted or further improved. Previous reports of the index showed us how member states' policies following global financial crisis affected gender equality and often at the disadvantage of women, unfortunately. And we can learn from the past to ensure that all the recovery measures of from the COVID-19 leave no one behind. The last year's index, of course, was focused on the effects of the COVID pandemic, and in particular looked at the effects of digitalization of the world of work and the consequences for gender equality. This topic is extremely relevant, of course, linked to the pandemic and the ways in which the working lives of women and men have been affected by it. New types of job and innovative ways of working through online platforms were analyzed to gain an understanding of who is doing these jobs and whether they help to hinder gender equality. The results have shown that the profound implication of new technologies for future progress towards gender equality across all index domains, most notably work, money, and knowledge. While it highlights some well-known challenges like gender segregation in the ICT education, employment, and research, it chiefly aims to shed light on less well-known aspects of digitalization. These include, for example, the different effects of precarious working conditions on women and men in certain forms of platform work, and the ways in which digital technologies can enable new form of harassment at work. The right of disconnection is one of the new elements that have been brought in also predominantly in the with the pandemics and the online form of smart working solutions. Therefore, this regional project that we are discussing today on empowering civil society organization combating discrimination and further strengthening women labor's rights is extremely important and should empower the civil society organization in Southeastern Europe to effectively hold relevant institutions accountable for implementing anti-discrimination legislation related to women's labor rights. Focusing now on Serbia, Serbia has made enormous strides in developing a comprehensive legal and policy framework on gender equality. The most recent landmarks advances include the adoption of the new and long-awaited law on gender equality at the end of May 2021. And the same day, the amendments were adopted to improve the law on prohibition of discrimination. In addition, a new strategy of preventing and combating gender-based violence against women and domestic violence and the new gender equality strategy have been adopted in 2021. These build upon and draw from pre-existing commitments to international instruments, as well as other earlier legislative changes, such as the law on domestic violence of 2017. Serbia has also advanced significantly in attempts to mainstream gender equality through the public sector, in particular through gender-responsive budgeting, which is mandatory since 2015. But despite these advances, indicators and recent qualitative studies show the persistence of wide gender gaps, and this also will be discussed throughout the second part of this event. Women are in a disadvantaged position compared to men in almost all spheres, economic, social, political, which pose serious challenges to their effective enjoyment of rights and autonomy. Gender gap persists almost in all indicators related to labor market. Employment rates for women remains lower than those of men in 2021, only with 41.9% compared to 56.6% of men, representing almost a 15% difference, which means that almost 60% of women that could be part of the labor force are not part of the labor force. According to the Gender Equality Index, Serbia has a lower score than most of EU countries in the domain of work, with gaps in participation, segregation, and quality of work. Segregation has also increased, and working women tend to be concentrated and often representing majorities in social sectors of the economy, such as education, health, and social protection. In most areas, the impact of COVID-19 pandemic, including measures introduced to curb its spread, had a negative impact on gender equality, increasing the risk of gender-based violence and incrementing the burden of unpaid care work, while also limited access to services and diverting resources away from equality policies. Gender-based violence in all forms remains a serious concern, as has been highlighted by a series of high-profile cases over the past year. Inequalities are deepened and compounded for those facing multiple forms of discrimination, such as women and girls living with disability, those of Roma origins, as well as other minority ethnic groups, older women, those living in rural areas, and who identify as LGBTI. I therefore hope that the results of the research report and that we will hear now today will raise awareness and improve the knowledge of general population on issues of gender-based violence and in the labor market, especially when it comes to more vulnerable groups of the society, which are marginalized for the time being. I take also the opportunity, since representatives of civil societies are present here today, to announce that we're going to launch a new call for proposal within the ADHR program for a budget of €1 million. This will be launched in the coming weeks. And the call will also have a component related to support gender equality. So those of you who are having very good ideas, please apply. And let me finish by emphasizing that our main goal, of course, is the full implementation of the gender equality principles. And through the accession process to the EU will strongly assist Serbia achieving these goals. And of course, the rest of the region, but it's over my remit in terms of responsibilities. I thank you very much all, and I look forward to the rest of the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leoneta, for this opening statement, for many information that you have shared with us. And certainly we will have some questions for you, as a representative of EU delegation, as I think we have same goal of establishing real gender equality in Serbia and in the region of Western Balkans. So thank you. And now I would like to ask my colleague Sofia Verbashki to prepare for her presentation, as she will share with us the core of this research for Serbia, basic information about the methodology, and of course the main findings and results and recommendations of the research. So Sofia, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tamara. Thank you also for everybody who is here today, and for the panelists and for the audience. I think this is a topic that's really close to a lot of our hearts, so it's really my pleasure to be here as well with you. Now, I hope you can see my shared screen. My name is Sofia Verbashki, as my colleague has introduced me, and I am the project coordinator for this regional program in Serbia, and I have the pleasure of working alongside fantastic organizations like Victimology Society of Serbia, A11 Initiative for Economic and Social Rights, and ROSA. But I also am a researcher, so I'm here today as a coordinator and as a researcher, because the theme of today's presentation is the Gender-Based Discrimination in Labor in Serbia report. So I will jump right into it, and we can begin with just an overview of what I want to talk about. Now, for those who have seen the link in the chat, I hope you have seen it, and I hope you've actually had a chance to look at the report. You might notice that there is a lot missing on what I'm going to speak about today, and that is because I'm very limited with time, and so I've chosen to cut approximately 50% or more of the report. It is an extensive report. It is really thorough and detailed, and I do recommend that you have a look at it as well to get a more holistic picture of the research. When it comes to the methodology, this is just very brief. My colleague Tamara already introduced it, but you see in front of you here today the different methods of data collection that we used. Now, these are really similar to what we used in the first edition of the report as well. The differences are here and there, and so I want to just cover the differences in this second edition. First, the time frame that we used was between the first and second edition, so approximately 3 years. The first edition of the report, which was certainly the first of its kind, covered 2018 and 10 years prior. So it is a bigger data set that we had at that time to look at than we do for this report, and it's something to keep in mind. Also, the online survey that was conducted had fewer, responses, certainly because of the pandemic. And I'm sure that people were less willing to answer a 10 or 15-minute survey online and to stare at a screen a little bit longer, as we have been doing for 2 years now. So where we saw in the first edition, people were really excited to answer the survey. In the second edition, not so much. And I think there's a lot to be said there. Also, the survey was not statistically significant. And that's just a fancy way of saying that the data sample that we have doesn't reflect the demographic in Serbia. For example, more women responded to the survey, more highly educated women. And when we look at the makeup of the demographic of Serbia, that's certainly not the same as who responded to the survey. Having said that, over 400 people did respond. So that's still a significant number of people that we can use data and test the data and use all different tests with what we have in the data sample. In terms of the interviews, this year we were very pleased to have interviews with judges in different courts throughout the country, and not just in Belgrade. In the previous year, we didn't manage to have any interviews with judges. So this really, again, paints a much more holistic picture when we're talking about gender-based discrimination in labor, especially since a major part of the report is reporting, or rather underreporting. And before moving forward, I did introduce myself as a researcher. However, I do have to say that the lead researchers on this edition of the report were Nevena Kostic and Andrea Čolak. So a very big thank you to them for implementing the methodology and writing the publication that you have hopefully seen. The foundation of the report, and not just the report, I would say the entire program as well, is awareness. And so we want to find a way to gauge the awareness of the people who have answered the survey, and also awareness in the general public through different sorts of reports that we find, media, and so on. And so between the first and second edition, we see that there is it's quite what we would call common knowledge. People are very aware, and a high number of people are aware that gender-based discrimination in labor is illegal. So there is that distinction. It's not just a bad thing, it's certainly illegal, and people can recognize that it's written into the law. However, the challenge that we encountered in both 2018 and 2021 is that people are not certainly aware of how to define gender-based discrimination. It's hard to categorize, it's hard to define, and for people, it's also very difficult to tell apart from different forms of discrimination. So we can tell discrimination, but it's harder to really pinpoint the grounds on which the discrimination is occurring. That's a really big challenge, and that's certainly something that needs to be addressed. The next challenge, again, from 2018 and 2021, is reporting, or rather, again, under-reporting. And here you can see in the graph in front of you that in both years, people simply do not report the gender-based discrimination that is happening in their workplace, in hiring, in promotions, wherever. And it's almost across the board. Now, when it comes to the prevalence of gender-based discrimination, I just want to go through some of, again, relating to the data set, and I'm going to get very technical here, and I'll try to slow down for the interpreters as well. But the data set that we have was analyzed by Reactor. Reactor is a think tank and a civil society organization in Skopje, and they're a partner actually on this program as well. So Reactor used logistic regression to test whether the probability of experiencing gender-based discrimination in the workplace could be predicted by categories such as gender, age, or even salary. And so what came of these tests was, even though the overall model is not significant, the gender was the category that specifically predicts the probability of being discriminated in the workplace. In other words, the odds of experiencing gender-based discrimination in the workplace for women are 1,113 times higher than the odds for men. And that's when we control all other variables. So again, it is very technical. It sounds like a lot of math, probably because it is, but it's certainly something that we need to think about when our samples and our data are really showing just how much this takes place and how prevalent it is. And one thing that we encounter very often with this program, and not only with the research, all of the work in the program, is that when we speak about gender-based discrimination in labor, it's often categorized as the workplace, but labor takes place in so many other spaces. And there's certainly spaces where labor violations and mass labor violations take place. And one of them is hiring. And that's a very difficult space because it's part of labor, but it's also hard to hold an employer to account if they're your potential employer or an employer who in the end didn't hire you. So these are spaces that we really need to pay attention to and really widen what we mean by labor and go beyond just the workplace or paid labor or formal labor, for example. When it comes to hiring, we found in the data that the main grounds for discrimination that women were facing in the hiring process in the past 3 years were inappropriate questions such as family status or children, whether they plan to have children, things like that. So what this means is that 48% of women are encountering these questions. Again, not 48% of women in Serbia, but just from the sample that we have. And that means that these women are confronted with entering into a room and about to go into an an interview, and there's almost a 50% chance that they will be asked this question, whereas the same chances we don't see for men. And now this is really problematic. It means that it's really almost institutionalized. It's almost a part of the hiring process. That's how normalized these questions have become. And they're not simply inappropriate questions. I think a better way to phrase it would be illegal questions. They're certainly just not allowed. And so this is how commonplace the practice is, and this is how deeply rooted it is, that it just becomes a part of everyday life and hiring. And in terms of promotion, again, a very difficult part of labor to pinpoint and to define, since it's hard, again, to hold people to account. What we found was that 1 in every 10 women claimed to be denied a promotion due to her gender. So this was their response and their self-reflective response. However, we only had 1 man who had responded in the same way. So 1 in every 10 women versus 1 man from our data set. Again, this is, I think these are quite telling things. In terms of intersectionality, we certainly do not forget about different forms and different grounds of discrimination that take place. So when gender intersects with ability, with sexual orientation, gender identity or gender expression, or ethnicity. So we look at how Roma women experience gender-based discrimination in labor, how LGBTQIA+ communities experience it, and women with different abilities. Here I have on the screen just one quote that we received, and it's really telling of the intersections of not only gender and ability, but also access to health. And so it's just a horrific thing to have to encounter or to read. And I think a lot of us can't even imagine having this experience, yet this is one of many responses that we received. And in the first edition of the report, I think one of the biggest and the biggest reactions we received from people and the most feedback was actually pregnancy and maternity leave. I think some of the results and the responses shocked people, but I think also there's very little data on it as well. Very little research is done about it. And it's only now in the last few years that we've seen a lot of organizations and institutions have started to pay attention to maternity leave violations and to really advocate for change there. And so in this year, 21% of women responded that their legal right to paid maternity leave was denied in the last 3 years. Comparatively, it was 28% in the first edition of the report. Now, I want to highlight that 10% of the women who were given their maternity leave, which is, again, their legal rights, 10% had been pressured to return back to work earlier than they were supposed to. And before I move on, I also want to point out that 7% of women in the past indicated that in the past 3 years, during an interview, they were asked to provide medical proof that they are not pregnant. So this is, if this data and if this information shocks you, that's good, because it should be shocking you. It is still practices that exist, and it is really very little has changed between the first and second edition, unfortunately. In terms of sexual harassment, Reactor again applied some very technical sounding tests. Again, this is my warning, things are going to get very technical. When assessing the multivariate relations of the survey sample, what was concluded in this edition, as well as the first edition, is that gender is really the only significant predictor, or the only category that can predict whether or not sexual harassment will take place, or the chances of it taking place. So women, it was shown through our sample that women were 3,425 times more likely than men to experience sexual harassment at work. And that's really telling in every piece of research that we touched, every interview, every response. I mean, we see this over and over and over, and it's very much a part of this work and of labor and women's experience with labor, and especially in informal economies. And so just the last point here, I think, is very important as well, where it says that 10% of women who experience sexual harassment in the workplace in the past 3 years received a proposal for sex from either a colleague or a superior. I want to highlight that in most cases, it is indeed a superior, whereas this year we didn't actually have any men who reported the same. And when it comes to underreporting, yet again, here you see in front of you the different years and the comparison of why people did not report. And I want to highlight two things. One is in both years, men were much more likely to report that they are ashamed to report sexual harassment in the workplace. And then this year, women reported, 34% of women reported that they were afraid to lose their job, whereas no men had reported the same. And that's really important to note, that more than a third of women who had experienced it were afraid to report it because they thought they might lose their job. And that shows that there is something is backwards somewhere along the line. There's some sort of disconnect. The system is failing somewhere, either at an institutional level, within the mechanisms of the workplace, or most likely a combination of the two. So somewhere along the line, we go from a sexual violent act that happens on somebody's body or on their dignity to them not reporting it because they are afraid to lose their job. So if there's no protection mechanisms for these women, that means we are certainly failing in this field, and that needs to be addressed. That's an absolute priority. So I really want to highlight and really stress that. And before going into the recommendations, I just want a slight overall, maybe pros and cons, and some institutional observations that we had this year while working on the report. And to begin with, I mean, it was very welcome that we had interviews with judges. We were so pleased to have this contact. And it wasn't the same in the first year of the research, and it really showed how knowledgeable judges are and how much they work on the ground and how many other factors actually affect reporting, not just judges, but so many other moving parts. However, we also had responses from court clerks and administrators, secretaries in different courts throughout the country who told us that they have to manually count cases, case files, reports, claimants. And the way that a lot of courts determine whether or not men had filed the claims is not by a simple click of the button to pull up all the men or pull up all the women on their screen. They count by hand the first name of the claimant. And that's not only a wide margin of error and a space for human error. I mean, it just creates a space for error. In 2022, we can't have our systems not digitalized and not desegregated by gender. We absolutely must have them. And it's not only because we live in a digital world, it's also because these courts are backed up in the smallest municipalities, let alone bigger ones. Court cases for these types of discrimination cases can take minimum 4 or 5 years. So when you have backed up courts, the last thing you need is administrators and court clerks to be counting things by hand. I mean, it's just, it simply doesn't make sense if just the practicality of it doesn't make sense, let alone what it can do when it comes to influencing data errors in research, in policymaking, et cetera. And that's just not to dwell too much there, but it's really to paint a picture of what it looks like when collecting data. And the second thing I want to highlight when it comes to an institutional overview is the labor inspectorate offices. Now, this is the second time in a row that we were not able to secure any interviews with either the labor inspectorate offices or the Ministry of Labor, Employment, Veteran, and Social Policy. And there is this disconnect we've seen in the research, and there is a lot of confusion when it comes to people in interviews and with the survey. People simply don't know whether or not to report things to the labor inspector because there's a lot of mixed messages. We as researchers receive a lot of mixed messages about that's not our jurisdiction, that's not actually how we work, that's not actually what we do, things like that. However, then we pull up the 2019 annual report, and it clearly states that they do have a mandate to protect anti-discrimination. And they even go so far as to name vulnerable groups or groups made more vulnerable, such as women, older people, people with different abilities, even LGBTQIA+ communities. So they know that there is an emphasis on these types of grounds for discrimination. And yet we haven't seen a significant practice of the labor inspectorate offices treating such cases of discrimination. In terms of the recommendations, my own challenge to myself actually was to pick some very simple ones that can be done. The first one I've already mentioned, data management systems. That has to be done, and that has to be done sooner rather than later, and it has to be disaggregated by gender. That's an easy one. The other one is to harmonize legislation with the EU Work-Life Balance Directive. And I picked that one as well because it's something we have to do as part of the EU accession process methodology. Now, we have to do it sooner or later, and better that we do it sooner. And here is space for EU institutions to help. There is space for help with this, through advocacy, through watchdog mechanisms, through reporting and monitoring. This is something that has to be done, and the sooner we do it, the sooner we can address some major flaws in our legislation. So with that, I want to just conclude and thank you all for listening, and I'm really looking forward to the question and answer. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sofia, for this really interesting presentation. I think that you provided us with a lot of food for thought, but also, needs for action, concrete action, synchronized action on the national and regional level. So let us now go to Pristina and Nicole. I think that now it's time for you to tell us a little bit about regional perspective. So we mentioned it a few times already, how important it is for us. And when we say regional, we mean Western Balkan perspective. So I think you will present us now some major finding on the regional level. So please.
Yes, thank you very much. So the legal framework across the Western Balkans, we can say that the constitutions of all of the countries contain an explicit prohibition of discrimination of sex based on sex or gender. And most of the countries have ratified a broad range of international instruments. Since the first edition of this report in 2018, there has been important progress made in most of the countries, though the progress is mixed. Some of the remaining challenges to the legal framework are that no country yet complies fully with the EU Work-Life Balance Directive. Various issues exist related to leave rights. Sanctions are low, especially to be considered effective, proportionate, and dissuasive. The burden of proof is not adequately understood or prescribed in most of the countries. And approximation issues exist with protection for self-employed persons and exceptions or defenses. Many countries also do not sufficiently protect victims from victimization, meaning, as Sofia has explained so clearly, becoming a victim just because you report, which is, of course, illegal, but is not sufficiently captured in all of our legal frameworks. As mentioned, the survey was not statistically significant, but I do believe that the findings are very indicative of trends in the region. Findings suggest that some people still don't know that gender-based discrimination is illegal, and the percentage of respondents who did not know where to report gender-based discrimination has decreased since 2018, showing progress. The most known institution that people knew they could approach if they experienced discrimination was still the Labor Inspectorate. Country differences exist, and we have seen some very observable changes in a couple countries, such as Albania, for example, where many more respondents this time around knew about services provided by the Ombudsperson and the Commissioner for Protection Against Discrimination. In our view, this is due in part to some significant outreach efforts undertaken by civil society organizations, including through this action. Nevertheless, like in Serbia and the entire region, reporting remains very low. This is likely partially due to low awareness on how to report and what constitutes gender-based discrimination. And some of the main reasons, though, are not just awareness, but fear of losing their jobs, as Sophia has mentioned, concern over anonymity or fear of stigma, distrust that institutions would do anything, and the long, expensive procedures involved. In terms of prevalence in the region, a third of the survey respondents said that they had experienced some form of labor-related discrimination, gender-based discrimination in the recent 3 years. This included 36% of women respondents and 18% of men. The findings suggested also that women with disabilities, lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, intersex, and other identifying persons, including also persons from minority ethnic groups, have likely faced multiple or intersectional discrimination. The different forms of discrimination that we've seen have included especially discrimination in hiring, also as explained by Sophia is the case in Serbia. 2/3 of respondents in the region had said who had had interviews since 2018, said that they had experienced questions regarding their marital status, plans to marry, if they had children, if they plan to have children, and expressed concern that this may have affected them being hired or not. More women face discrimination than men in terms of promotion, and statistical data throughout the region show that the gender pay gap has persisted. We also had several cases, including specific cases of violations of pregnancy and maternity leave rights. In all of the countries, there were employed women respondents who became pregnant in the last 3 years, but did not receive any payment during their maternity leave from their employer or the government. Some respondents also said that employers illegally terminated their contracts during their pregnancies or leaves. Sexual harassment at work has also remained widespread, with 1/3 of the survey respondents saying they had suffered some form of sexual harassment at work in the last 3 years. This included substantially more women than men. 2/3 of the women who suffered discrimination said persons in higher positions of power perpetrated it, yet only 5% had reported it. In all the countries, COVID-19 has affected women's position in the labor market, as we all know, and we have detailed information within the report regarding different ways that the COVID-19 pandemic has affected women, including employers using the pandemic to justify layoffs, to not pay wages, including wages for time already worked. If we look at the institutional response to discrimination across the region, of course it differs, but there are trends. Across the region, as in Serbia, institutional data remains very poor, and few institutions maintain gender desegregated data or data desegregated by sector. As few cases have been reported to institutions, particularly those that deal with crime, few institutions have experience treating such cases. Labor inspectorates in particular across the region lacked knowledge regarding gender-based discrimination. They also lacked human resources and capacities for treating such cases. They recurrently noted this was not in their jurisdiction. We also saw a recurring trend of delays in handling court cases. Yet there have been a few positive practices. For example, ombudsperson institution representatives generally were quite knowledgeable, and there are good practices like in Bosnia, where they have treated several cases of gender-based discrimination since 2018. Similarly, the commissioners on protection from discrimination in the countries where they exist have also increased their treatment of such cases, especially in Albania. Labor unions still have limited knowledge about gender-based discrimination, and few cases have reached the unions. Our research suggests that throughout the region, this relates to women and men's limited knowledge of labor union services, their limited trust in unions, and that their membership has remained low, which has hindered the ability of unions to provide services and assist cases. In 2018, when we did our first research, very few CSOs dealt with gender-based discrimination. But now, CSOs in all of the Western Balkan countries have been involved in informing, referring, assisting, and monitoring cases. We have seen CSOs on the front lines and showing resilience amid the COVID-19 pandemic, offering free legal aid and helping women to address gender-based discrimination and labor rights violations. We have seen CSOs open helplines, provides strategic litigation, and including in Albania one of the first class action suits that we have seen that treats gender-based discrimination in the region. Now, if we come to the recommendations, there are some recurring recommendations across the region. This includes addressing the legal fragmentation to avoid confusion in how terms are defined, approximating legal frameworks, including related to self-employed persons, protection from victimization, and the sharing of adequate sharing of burden of proof. Also, as said, there's a need to harmonize all laws, especially labor laws in the region, with the EU Work-Life Balance Directive, especially maternity, paternity, parental, and carers leave rights, as well as flexible working hours. There's a need to increase sanctions so that they're effective, proportionate, and dissuasive, and to improve the third-party standing to allow CSOs to better support victims in making complaints. As Sophia said, governments can improve their management of data. They can institutionalize training for all actors who are treating discrimination cases, ensuring they understand what is gender-based discrimination. There's a need for coordinated interinstitutional awareness campaigns to encourage people to report discrimination and build trust in institutions and how to report it, and to ensure efficient processing of cases by the institutions, especially working to empower labor inspectorates and ensure oversight and functioning of them. Some key recommendations we have for the European Union are to prioritize the implementation of these reforms on gender-based discrimination as a conditionality of the EU accession process, to encourage countries to align their legal frameworks with the EU Work-Life Balance Directive, to monitor reforms using a standardized approach across the countries in the country reports, to continue meeting and supporting civil society organizations, especially women's rights organizations, in their important work to raise awareness, provide legal aid, and thereby monitor institutional performance. And the EU can encourage contractors, especially those working with police, prosecutors, judges, and other actions that are funded by the EU, to cooperate with civil society and to increase institutional knowledge so that they can improve the practice of institutions in treating gender-based discrimination. Altogether, I thought in the end that we need a bit of reflecting on what has happened in this 4 years of our work together in the region and a bit of a look forward. And so in closing, we can say in reflection that definitely the COVID-19 pandemic has slowed our work and the legal and institutional reforms that we had planned to make in institutions. Unfortunately, it also provided, in a way, opportunities to bring to the attention and to treat discrimination cases and violations of women's rights that came out of this situation. Our coalition has contributed to some key improvements across the region. This includes at least 17 legal and policy amendments that have been put forward by our CSO partners, more than 805 diverse women who've received legal aid and a support in addressing labor rights violations, and more than 212 different organizations across the Western Balkans who have been more involved in advocating for improving women's labor rights and strengthening our network for this advocacy. Yet despite these great successes that we've managed to achieve, our experience suggests that increasing knowledge about rights and reporting mechanisms, transforming attitudes, furthering rule of law, and improving institutional response all require time, resources, advocacy, and ongoing monitoring of employers and institutions in order to bring about transformative and lasting change. And the EU accession process provides a perfect opportunity for improving our legal frameworks to better protect and to engage the EU in political dialogue as foreseen in the EU Gender Action Plan 3 to encourage our governments to make progress. For us, this triangle of cooperation between government, civil society, the EU, and other international actors is important for pushing forward these legal and institutional changes. And we believe that there needs to be continued funding and engagement of civil society to hold the institutions accountable, to provide legal aid that women trust, and to monitor these institutions in their assistance of cases. So we could remain committed to continuing this work with you in the future, and thanks so much for listening.
Thank you, Nicole, for this presentation. It was especially at least for me personally, it was really good to see about some results, some really positive changes that that program contributed to in the region of Western Balkans. So I think that it is really good also to underline some results and some positive changes that we achieved. And now I will ask Sanja Ćopić from Victimology Society of Serbia to tell something about their work. Victimology Society was one of the partner organizations in Serbia, and basically you are working directly on the ground, so to say, with the with the persons who experienced some sort of gender-based discrimination in labor. So I hope, Sanja, you will tell us more about some concrete experience from the ground.
Thank you, Tamara. Thank you for inviting me to this event, and I'm really happy to represent Victimology Society of Serbia today. Victimology Society was a partner to this project furthering women's labor rights, and Victimology Society of Serbia is an organization that has been advocating for the rights of all victims, so including also victims of different forms of discrimination and human rights violations for 25 years now. I will point out maybe several key issues related to gender-based discrimination in the labor market, which are based on our practical work in terms of providing assistance, support, and empowering women who are victims of either gender-based discrimination or work-related abuse or other forms of violation of their labor rights. Assistance was provided within Victimology Society of Serbia's Victim Support Service, VDS Info and Victim Support. And we also made some conclusions based on the analysis of these cases, but also based on the know-how and experience change that we also had within this project, within panel discussions with the stakeholders that are dealing with various aspects of the position of women at the labor market. I'm also afraid that I will maybe repeat many of what has been said today, and because we were just finding out similar things, and I would only remind at the very beginning that we could also hear that the latest gender equality index for the Republic of Serbia suggests that Serbia is making continuous, albeit slow, progress in improving gender equality in general. And this is also visible in the domain of work. But employment gender gap, different forms of gender inequalities still exist. And when I was listening to what Sofia was speaking about, and also Nicole, I could also say that the results of the survey are actually not much different and not much better in comparison to the research Victimology Society of Serbia did in the 2011, 2012. So that even almost 10 years after that research, we have almost similar data. So the field of labor is still, as I said, characterized by high gender inequalities, but what is also visible from the cases that we had is that it is very hard in practice to recognize gender-based discrimination in general, but particularly when we speak about the field of labor and employment. And it is also in practice very hard to make distinction between discrimination and other forms of violation of labor rights of women. And also very often when it comes also to the work-related abuse. So these things are very mixed and it is hard to distinguish them, which also impacts the way how these women could look for the protection, particularly when we speak about legal protection and the court protection. Also, when we speak about discrimination, I think that we should also highlight who those particularly vulnerable groups of women are. They need to be visible. And from our experience, these are women entrepreneurs, women who work in the sectors of service provision, in the healthcare sector, which was particularly visible during the COVID-19 pandemic. Then women with disabilities, and also hard to employ categories of women. So women 45 plus, single mothers, mothers of children with disabilities, also women who are members of ethnic or minority groups, rural women, etc. And I think that also from our perspective, these women were even more vulnerable during our project implementation because it coincided with the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic. What we could also see from practice is that women are exposed to discrimination both in private and in state sector. So there are not big differences. But on the other hand, it is also visible that women working in lower status occupations are also more exposed to discrimination, particularly in those occupations that are characterized by poor working conditions, by low income. And also women, and it is, I think, very often we can meet that often in practice that women work on a temporary basis, so have temporary or occasional contracts, and they are also exposed to discrimination more. So women are also, from our practice, we could see exposed to discrimination in the process of hiring, and this is what you already mentioned in terms of asking different questions which are actually forbidden by our positive legislation concerning their marital status, children, sick leaves, etc. And of course, on the other hand, they are exposed to different forms of discrimination at work. This is mainly related to inability to use sick leave. Also, from our practice, women are exposed to discrimination after returning from maternity leave. So the pregnancy and maternity leave is also rather problematic. And of course, they face effects of the glass ceiling. We also have quite a lot of women who are approaching our service for work-related abuse, including sexual harassment. So you also mentioned these cases. And I would also like to just remind again about women who faced various forms of discrimination in the context of pandemic caused by COVID-19. And that was particularly visible at the very beginning of our project, so in 2020 and during the state of emergency, which needs to be kept in mind for maybe further improvements of legislation and policy and practice related to crisis situations in general, which might happen in the future as well. So, for example, women we assisted were those who work in, for example, sector of service provision. And these sectors were particularly affected by the complete cessation of their work or partial cessation of the work during the state of emergency, which of course affected their salaries and their position in the labor market. Then we have to be aware of women who make the majority of those working in the shops, in stores, and they were really overburdened with the work during the state of emergency and afterwards. Or then the increase in the so-called unpaid care jobs, which are again, particularly those related to households and which are mostly performed by women. Again, the COVID-19 pandemic also brought the closure of schools, of daycare centers, kindergartens, which also affected women, particularly mothers, and especially those who are single mothers or those who live alone with their children, with disabilities, having no assistance and support. And also what is visible in the crisis situation, and which both Sofia and Nicole and the colleague from the EU delegation stressed, is the relevance of harmonizing Serbian legislation with the life and work balance directive, because this was one of the main problematic also issues related to the work of women during the COVID-19 pandemic, and particularly during the state of emergency, because even if possibilities existed, many of them were not allowed to work from home. So it was rather problematic for these women to make a balance between private and professional life, particularly for those women who live alone with their children or who had the children with disabilities, etc. So quite many problems. And also what is important to mention is that these women are not only discriminated against on the basis of their sex or gender, but also on other bases. So we have really, in many cases, we had multiple discrimination and multiple bases of discrimination, for example, Roma women, women with disabilities, etc. However, although we also mentioned that Serbia has a rather comprehensive, we would say, legal and policy framework related to gender-based discrimination and the labor in Serbia, the practice is still rather poor, I would say. So there is still a lack of reaction from the competent institutions. And we also would like to mention here the Labor Inspectorate, which should have much bigger role in protection of women from both violation of labor rights and also including discrimination and gender-based discrimination in particular. There is still very low level of information and awareness among workers, including women, about what discrimination is and what discrimination based on sex and gender is. So we have to still work on raising awareness about what constitutes discrimination so that these people could be aware of that and then to be able to report. But of course, then we need a better system of protection, particularly court protection, because court proceedings for gender discrimination at the labor market are rather rare, almost non-existing. So there is a lack of relevant case law, which makes impossible to assess implementation of laws in practice. And I would only say, and if the court proceedings start, unfortunately, they last for years. And I think that it should maybe open the floor for maybe also a broader use, of course, building capacities of relevant stakeholders to proceed with these cases, but also for broader use of mediation and maybe other restorative approaches in dealing with such cases in practice. And I would then also point out the relevance of the role of the Commissioner for the protection of equality and protecting women from discrimination in the labor market, which should be much bigger, and that people should be aware of their role and their existence. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sanja, very much for this really interesting and important presentation. And it is really good, I think, to hear how it really looks like on the ground and dealing with specific cases, with concrete cases of discrimination and gender-based discrimination. And now is the time basically for us to open questions and answers part of today's event. I think our pastime is pretty good. I think we are few minutes behind, but that's totally okay, because I think that we had really interesting presentation, rich in details and in concrete data. So now it's time for our audience basically to give comments, questions, or whatever you would like to share with us and with our panelists today. So maybe I can break the ice while you are still thinking and still trying to phrase your questions and comments. And I would like basically to direct one question to Ana Milenic. Ana Milenic is a gender focal person in EU delegation in Serbia, and since Leoneta has to leave this event, she has other obligations, but Anna is with us to respond to some of our questions. And thank you, Anna, for being with us and having time for us. I believe that all of us think that it is important really to have somebody from EU delegation here so that we can discuss things that are of common interest, as I said. So I would like to ask you one question about basically harmonized regional approach when it comes to Western Balkans, and to what extent has the EU discussed in Serbia and in Brussels towards a harmonized regional approach, including attention to how country basically treat gender-based discrimination in labor, and also, related to fundamental rights, but also related to labor and employment. Will it be treated consistently in the future as an issue which is common for the region?
Okay, thank you very much, Tamara, for the question, and thank you very much for organizing this event, this online conference. It's always a pleasure to participate on the events organized by Kvinna till Kvinna, but also all your other partners, women civil society organizations from Serbia, but also from the region. And I think that now we have a really long-lasting cooperation with all women organizations from the region, not only through this regional project, but also through some other regional initiatives and projects that we have and that are run by our headquarter colleagues. Regarding your question and this regional approach, so I have to tell you that in principle, all countries in Western Balkan are following the same methodology. And you know that last year we have changed this methodology regarding EU accession, that now we have clusters. And for example, Serbia has opened for the time being 3 clusters. And we are hoping that during this year, we will also open this cluster where we have Chapter 19, which is for us important and which is dealing with the labor law and in this sense, discrimination in labor rights. Here in Serbia, we are following all these activities of the Ministry for Labor and Employment, who are preparing the action plan and who are, preparing all these things regarding Chapter 19. And we are really hope that during this year it will be open. Now, at the moment, you know that we are in this election campaign, and somehow in Serbia, every 2 years, we are in this pre-election and election campaigns, which is for us slowing down all our work and processes. And we can see that these reforms are also slowed down. Plus, we had these 2 years of COVID, which also slowed down all activities. But anyhow, we really hope that after the elections and after new government, we will have a quick and fast start for the work on the opening of Chapter 19 and a cluster which is dealing with the Chapter 19. In the meantime, delegation in Serbia will continue to cooperate and to work with the civil society organizations, especially with the women civil society organizations. So as we at the beginning, as Leoneta said, we have prepared this country level implementation plan of GAP 3 during last year. And we are hoping that the women civil society organizations will be involved in the implementation of this country level implementation plan. Therefore, we have this new call for proposals for this thematic program for human rights that will be open very soon. And we really hope that we will have some very good action grants with the women civil society. And in that way, we will support the work of women society organizations, also other civil society organizations, and that we will continue this cooperation in this very important work. So I think that also in the headquarters, there is the same approach, that the colleagues in headquarters are preparing also now this regional call for proposals where regional networks can also apply. So I think that there will be possibility also for your network to continue your work, not only in this topic of discrimination in labor law, but also in other topics which are very important for us. And in that way, you can have these 2 pillars of work on these regional networks, but also work on this national level and cooperation with these national programs. So every delegation in the region has the gender focal person. We have this network of gender focal persons, and I think that your organizations are very well known. Who are the colleagues in the region with whom you can have your coordination on daily basis. So if you don't know, for example, in some delegations, if they maybe change these contact points, I am the one who can always provide you this information, and I can always connect you with the colleagues in other delegations. So in principle, I think this is, that I hope that we will continue to have our good cooperation during this year. And I'm really looking forward for new projects and new activities with women civil society organizations.
Thank you, Anna. We are also looking forward for new programs and new cooperation, and we are looking also forward to our governments in the region to understand the importance of this thing, really. And we also hope that the EU can help also in that way to really help them understand why and how it is important for all of us. Thank you. So now we received one question, so I will read it. Thank you for the presentations. I would love to hear more elaborations around the recommendations, especially from Sanja, but also other colleagues. So yeah, because recommendations, usually we let that for the very end of our presentations, and then moderators jump in and remind that it's time to wrap up. So maybe now it's the time really to elaborate more on recommendations, because that is actually why we are doing this. So maybe Sanja, you can start if you want to elaborate more on whatever you think it is the most important at the moment, and then Sophia and Nicole can continue.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I already pointed out that there is an importance to work on improving still legislation and institutional framework for responding to gender-based discrimination. What we also should recommend based on our data is that it is important to work on improving mutual cooperation between state institutions and non-governmental civil society organizations that work on protection against gender-based discrimination and violation of rights in the field of labor and employment. We also think that it is important to increase the competencies and also the powers of the labor inspectorate, which should be responsible for protection against gender-based discrimination and violation of labor and employment rights, so that they should be more aware of these issues and to be able to identify and also to address properly gender-based discrimination in the labor market. We also, what Nicole, I think, mentioned, put as one recommendation the necessity to make labor unions more transparent, more accessible to workers, and also to somehow raise awareness of workers about and their understanding of what the labor unions are, that they are not only those who should help them in buying some issues, but some things, but also to protect labor unions should really protect workers, and also to work on building capacities of representatives of the labor unions to better identify and respond to cases of gender discrimination and violations of labor rights, and to be really someone who should connect workers with either those management of the organizations or other institutions outside of it in order to protect them. Of course, it is important to work on prevention of gender-based discrimination through raising public awareness and levels of knowledge about what constitutes gender discrimination in the labor market, to promote mechanisms of protection against gender-based discrimination, to promote policies against gender-based discrimination, and maybe what could be also relevant for prevention is, for example, to promote successful examples of protection against gender-based discrimination in the workplace, which might give the wind to those who are suffering from discrimination or other violations of human rights to try to look for the protection from the state. And just a final remark is, as I'm also a researcher, I think the data is very important and the monitoring system. So there is we need a systematic data collection and establishing the mechanism for regular monitoring of implementation of laws and policies in practice, because we could only really work on improving the system if we have evidence. So to really advocate for improving of the legislation, policy and practice, which would be evidence-based.
Thank you, Sanja. And I don't know, Sophia or Nicole, if you want to add something on recommendations.
Sure, I can step in and add something before we move on. And I think I'll keep it really focused on Serbia. I know this is a regional program, but I think from the recommendations in the report, I mean, there's pages of recommendations. And so to just pick a few is a challenge, especially, I mean, in a presentation setting and things like that. But one thing that I would like to highlight beyond what I mentioned in the presentation is that there seems to be, from the interviews we've conducted, there seems to be quite a lot of knowledge about gender-based discrimination in labor with institutional representatives and people working in lots of different fields of work, including civil society organizations. However, despite this knowledge, the practice is the issue. And we often receive pushback when we say that we do require gender-sensitive training. And there is a lot of pushback from institutions that, no, we don't need that. We already know it's illegal. But there seems to be a need for that, because there seems to be a disconnect between what's written on paper and practice. So this does seem like a very simple thing. And I know Nicole also brought it up as well, that we need to streamline these things across different institutions. We need to have gender-sensitive training to cover all fields of gender-based discrimination and an intersectional approach, so on and so forth. And it's usually a recommendation that's discredited, but I think the research speaks for itself that it is necessary, it is required. We're skipping a step if we don't, and we're expecting a bit too much if we are skipping that step. Another thing is that, I mean, the bibliography is probably the one thing everybody skips in a report, but the reason I bring up the bibliography is because when you have a look at it, you'll see that the majority of the research on this topic is civil society organizations. So again, we hear a lot of the time that there is no official data. There's a lot of data gaps at institutional levels, at national levels, and we hear this across the region, not just in Serbia. And it is very telling when most of the research reports are civil society organizations who are stepping in to fill this data gap. And a lot of them are also providing services. For example, Sanja is sitting with us today. She works on research to fill the research gaps. She also is working on the ground with people who are calling in, who are experiencing these violations that we talk about in the report. So this is, she's juggling two things at once, and this is very, very common. So more support to civil society organizations to keep doing the work that they're doing, to keep doing the research, because they are very, very obviously the monitoring mechanism in the region, and that's really important to be able to make sure they're still there. And Sanja brought up a fantastic point about the promoting good examples, and that's one thing we do with this second edition of the report, is we dedicated a lot of space to very good examples of case studies here in Serbia of good practice, of where institutions could step in and how they can help get a person from point A to point B. And there are some examples from the Commissioner for the Protection of Equality as well, and the Agency for Peaceful Settlement of Labor Disputes. So these are mechanisms that do exist, they are in place, and they can help, especially when you're faced with trials that can take up to 5 years. So promoting good practice is also, I would like to second what Sanja said, and I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you, Sophia. And we have one question in Q&A feature from Alternative Girls Center. So it is basically, the question is in Serbian, so I will translate it. in English. So it is a question about women employed in IT sector, and the question did the research tackled this experience of women from IT sector, and to what extent is gender-based discrimination is present in that sector, especially having in mind specific working conditions, home office working for international and multinational corporation, basically. So it is a really specific working position. So whoever wants, maybe Sophia, you are the right person to try to respond to this.
I can certainly try, and I can begin by saying that we didn't actually focus on any specific sector at all. So there is no sector focus. What we did divide between was public and private sectors. So that's where the division is. Specific sectors are a little bit more challenging to focus on, and we have had this discussion as well with the methodology, which even businesses and how to categorize what business means and things like that. So these become much bigger methodological questions. If you focus on one, why not another? And then you have to sort of speak to why you chose what you chose. And again, we don't have the sample big enough to be able to divide by very specifically by IT sector or others. What I can say is that the data has shown this this idea of the precarious private. So the private sector is very much a space where we have seen a lot of labor violations taking place. Now, whether or not I can confirm today that it is certainly going to take place more often in private or public, I can't say. I just simply don't have the research foundation to say that. What I can say is that our research does indicate that there are a lot fewer mechanisms in private companies, especially these larger multinational companies that outsource in Serbia for labor violations. And it is very common during the pandemic that people had no access to their labor rights when there was no mechanism that could kind of perform a watchdog role when they're in their homes. So there were mass violations of people working extensive hours with no breaks and still needing to catch up on work and things like that. And that was very clear in the IT sector as well through some of the research reports that do exist. However, it did pose a serious challenge to be able to keep your labor rights as they're written in law when there is no mechanism that can really monitor in your own household. And so this is my sort of half answering the question and half opening it up for potentially some future research or future fields of research that we could work on and fill these data gaps.
Exactly, Sophia. Thank you. I think that it really calls for some specific research on that, on the position of women and all the others in these industries, which are a little bit different from what we know when we are talking about working place or working conditions. So thank you. And we have one more question, I think, and time to respond to that before we move to closing remarks. So this question is from our colleague Stina Magnusson-Boer from Kvinna till Kvinna, and she says the new call mentioned by Anna is very good news, and thank you for mentioning that. I would also be interested to know how the European Union delegation will secure the participation of civil society organizations, and especially women civil society organizations, in the implementation of the CLIP GAP 3 beyond programming through, for example, regular consultations or something like that. So Anna, this one is for you, please.
Okay, thank you, Stina. Yes, we are organizing regular consultation meetings with civil society organizations, and particularly with women civil society organizations. So we will have at least once a year, but I think maybe twice a year, we will have like meetings with organizations regarding implementation of CLIP. So last year, when we were preparing this new updated gender country profile and country level implementation plans, we organized several meetings with the civil society organizations, and we had this really huge consultation process. So during this year, we will organize like monitoring of the implementation of CLIPs. So one of the idea was that we also need to provide financial means to civil society, and therefore we are opening this new call for proposal for civil society. And in these priorities, in this new call, you will see that one of the first priority is support to gender equality. In that sense, this is the way how we will ensure that women civil society organization will receive grants, since this is open grant call for grants. So we will continue to have our regular meetings. We are organizing also regular policy meetings with the civil society for the preparation of annual reports that we are publishing every year in October, and for the preparation of non-paper for rule of law. So we will continue with this practice. So in that sense, I think that during the year, we will have a lot of opportunities to meet and to discuss with the women's civil society organizations.
Thank you, Anna. And in the meantime, we received one more combination of comment and question. So I will also read that one. From Amaya Stajcic. Congratulations to the great research report to the team. Thank you for the presentations. Great recommendations, including those to CCOs and legal aid providers. I would like to hear more about how do you see specific role of women CSOs play so far in improving the situation for women in the labor market. So I think this one is really for Nicole, for Sofia, for Sanja, so you can really give your opinion about the concrete role and concrete contribution of women civil society organizations in improving position of women in the labor market, which is a little bit wider than just discrimination, gender-based discrimination in the labor market. And I think it is important for all of us to be reminded that this is really part of one wider problem. So whoever wants to start.
Maybe I can start, and I hope, I mean, my answer would be really to highlight the work of organizations like Victimology Society of Serbia. So I really hope Sanja also can step in and speak about a little bit about her perspective on this question. But I think there is the role that women's civil society plays is, as I mentioned, they are really the leaders of monitoring mechanisms, watchdog roles, things like that, the shadow reporting, collecting data, implementing services, providing services, whether they're services to address the issues or mitigate and prevent a few steps behind. And they're also, what we've seen in Serbia, and especially through this program, Rosa, for example, in Zrenjanin, works on raising awareness, but it's not simply raising awareness by putting up posters everywhere. They raise awareness by taking several steps back and working with young girls and starting really young through workshops with young girls. So rather than addressing the problem when it happens, let's start young. Let's work with young girls in high school so that they understand right out of high school that they have rights, that they have written into law what can or cannot be asked at an interview, what can or cannot happen in their employment, where to report it, and things like that. So this same presentation we have, they have with young girls in a language that they understand. So this is so powerful, and this is the kind of work that they do. And when it comes to advocacy, and I won't speak about Victimology Society of Serbia, I'll let Sanja speak for herself, but just on the side of advocacy, A11 economic and social rights, their advocacy activities include a combination of research, of panel discussions and things like that, but also really high level advocacy directed towards EU institutions and national mechanisms to sit with them and to discuss, but to also push forward recommendations that can benefit women who are experiencing gender-based discrimination in labor. Because A11 as well, on the other side of their work, they're also receiving phone calls from women who have received and survived or been victims of this form of discrimination or sexual harassment in the workplace. So again, they have several roles, but that also means that there's several spaces for women's civil society to play in improving the situation. And of course, when we're streamlining gender equality throughout all of our institutions and how they address these topics, there's no better organizations to be there in the room for helping streamline these mechanisms than civil society organizations who are working on the topic. So I'll finish with that, and maybe Sanja can step in with some more information.
Yes, Sanja, if you want to share.
Just shortly, because I'm sorry, I will have to leave the meeting for another one. Along with what Sofia said, is that from the Victimology Society of Serbia perspective, our role, I think, is also very important in working with the individual victims, in assisting them, empowering them, informing them, in order to be able to try at least to exercise their labor rights through the system, although we are aware that it is very hard and long-lasting process and very exhausting for many of these women, but also probably for men who also face different forms of discrimination. And the role of civil society organizations are very important in advocating for women's labor rights and for their protection. And what we could also see that it is the role of civil society is also very important in networking with different stakeholders. And from the project we did, it was really important for us that we, for example, established cooperation with ROSA, with also A11, with other organizations, civil society organizations, but also with some people from different state institutions, from some trade or labor unions. And I think that through this networking, maybe we will try to work further to do something in order to improve situation for women in the labor market.
And finally, Nicole, you also wanted to say something on this. Please go.
Thank you. Actually, I don't know that I would add much more. I think that they've covered the main areas, and I would fully agree with what's been said. But maybe I could use my minute to provide one more question to Anna, since she's here with us and answering all kinds of questions today. One thing we've tried doing in Kosovo, and I'm curious if you're doing it also in Serbia, is try to get other actors like the contractors of the EU in other programs engaged in work on gender equality, which, as you know, is foreseen in Gender Action Plan 3, that all the actions the EU supports will have some type of gender component. And specifically related to gender-based discrimination, I mean, this is labor, this is policies that employers should have, this is affirmative actions potentially in hiring when it comes to employment. Is there anything that the EU is doing in Serbia to encourage its contractors in other programs across different sectors to install policies against gender-based discrimination, or to train the institutions they're working with on gender-based discrimination as part of their broader training portfolios for these institutions? Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Nico, for this question. Here in Serbia, we have one program that we are now implementing for 4 years. So we are doing this together with colleagues from UN Women, and practically we are giving support to coordination body for gender equality and to the Ministry of European Integration. And within this pillar with the Ministry of European Integration, we are trying to organize training for all line ministries for example, for programming of future IPA projects. So in every line ministry, we have a gender focal person, but also we are organizing trainings for all employees of those ministries, especially in IPA programming, that they are participating from beginning of this IPA cycle, that at the beginning we have include all of them, all their expertise, and we are trying then to give this gender mainstreaming expertise to provide to them, and then to develop these new programs and activities that will be from beginning gender mainstream. So next step is that we are now providing the trainings for the monitoring of the implementation of all these activities and programs. And we are trying to do this not only for IPA programs, but also with all other bilateral programs, because Ministry of European Integration is responsible also for all donors. So in that sense, we are trying to provide this network of colleagues and people who will have this knowledge and who will not change with every change of the government. So this is our idea, that we have a network of operational colleagues that will stay in the ministry, and that we will have like this network of people from the ministries that will work with us for years now in these gender mainstreaming trainings. So for the time being, this is the only project that we have with the Ministry of European Integration and Coordination body, but also we are trying to have this kind of project with civil society organizations. I know that in Kosovo you have this very good practice that your colleagues from your organizations have been involved in this programming cycle with the IPA projects. And I think this is also a very good example. And we are now trying to have something similar in Serbia. So we really hope that, we can duplicate your good examples from Kosovo regarding this.
Thank you, Anna. And we are basically at the very end of today's event. So there are only few minutes left. And I know, Sofia and Nicole, that you already shared a lot, really, from different perspectives, from different angles. But if there is something that you would like to share with us for the very end of this event, if there is some message maybe that you would like to send, or to mention something that you forgot to mention and you find it important, this is the time for you. You can have a minute or two for just closing remarks.
Okay, I will start while the others are thinking. But I think for the closing remarks, I mean, for me, if I could see the audience while I presented the report, I think I would just see people staring back at me thinking, I already know this, why are you telling me this? And that's the point. That's exactly the point of this research, is that these are things we know. It is so clear to us that these violations are taking place, but they're being treated as anecdotal. And now we have it in writing in the first edition and in the second edition in 6 different countries in the Western Balkans, and 2 regional reports that are all pointing a million arrows to this issue and saying, and tons of red flags, and saying, this is an issue that we have to keep working on and keep addressing. And as women's civil society organizations, we are working on it and we keep addressing it. We are providing the services through either us ourselves in the coalition or our partner organizations on the program as well, among others who have been doing this work for decades. So the support has to be there, and it has to be continued and long-term, certainly beyond this program as well. And that's really where I want to end. And thank you all for listening and for participating. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sophia. Nicole, do you have something for the very end?
I think I would just echo what Sophia said and say that we are very committed to continuing with this coalition across the region. We thank Kvinna for their support that is helping us to sustain our work even after our officially funded work ends. We are activists at heart, and thank you to all the organizations in Serbia and across the region that have been engaged. And we hope that we can all continue to engage with whatever resources we do have available in these issues. And thanks to the European Union for their continued attention to this, and happy to hear that this will be still a priority moving forward. We think that this cooperation is so essential among the EU, among civil society, and hopefully where we can with our governments as well, to all work together towards addressing these serious issues. So we look forward to continuing this cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicole, for being with us. And finally, Anna, I mean, we used your time to the maximum. So if you want to share something for the very end, please go.
No, thank you very much, Tamara. I also want to thank to all organizations involved in this research, to Kvinna till Kvinna, to all regional women's civil society organizations. Especially, I think that's very good work of Rosa from Zrenjanin is important for us, of A11, of the Victimology Society. So, but also I have to say that all other women organizations that are active in Serbia, it's very important that, you know, we somehow support their work, and we in delegation will, of course, continue to support the work of civil society organization and to have this fruitful and very good cooperation. So once again, thank you all for this very, very interesting and research and presentation today.
Thank you, Anna. And on my behalf, I would also like to thank you, the panelists for this event, also the public who was with us throughout this event. Kvinna till Kvinna will continue to deal with this topic and to deal with other topics which are really connected to this, and we will try really to look into nexuses between gender-based violence and women economic rights and empowerment, and gender-based discrimination and labor. So we are really here to stay and to continue our work, because we believe that our society really needs that. Thank you all very much, and at this point we will end this event and see you when we have some other research or something interesting to share with the public. Thank you all.